Hello again, and welcome back. We'll do another installment of my series. I I think I'm going to call this series A Study in Philosophy. It's not terribly original, but I've never really been great at naming things, so there you go. So that's my new series name, and this will be the second full installment of that, in which I'm talking about personhood. Now, in my previous video, I talked about certain performance views of personhood and how many people, especially philosophers, believe that in order to be a person, you first must be able to function as a person. You're not a person until you're self-aware or until you're conscious or you're able to feel pain or these kinds of things. Now, the main issue with these ideas is that it puts the cart before the horse in that it argues that your function is what makes a person what it is, but the problem with that is that in the same way that a human being has to exist before they can develop all of their human parts, a person must be able to exist before they can develop their personal properties. Consciousness, self-awareness, these other things are not just kind of free-floating entities that we can touch and that we can put onto something. In fact, they're properties of persons. They develop as the person develops. So it's actually the case that form precedes function. You have to be able to be a member of a personal species in order to become, or in order to develop the properties that persons, as we think of them, ordinarily have. So that's one of the issues that I don't think I really touched on last time, but that's kind of the fundamental problem with these performance ideas of personhood. Now, these performance ideas of personhood are kind of grounded in what might be called property dualism, in which they would argue that there are two kinds of substance: the physical substance, which is your body, and the mental substance, which is kind of everything that goes on upstairs: your thoughts, your experiences, or your awareness of your experiences, at any rate, your consciousness, your self-awareness, all of these kinds of things. And so last week I talked about the episodic problem, in which if our personhood was grounded in the functions that we can perform, such as our self-awareness, then we would cease to be a person every time we cease to be self-aware, such as when we fall asleep or into a reversible coma or something like that. Now, a philosopher who is a substance dualist, who kind of believes that that a person is identical to their mind, would argue that the reason that we retain our personhood through all of these experiences, when we fall asleep, we wake up as the same person who fell asleep, is because we're psychologically connected to ourself from time t, where we fell asleep, to time t1 or tx or whenever, which is the point at which we wake up. We're the same person throughout each of those points of time, and it's because of our psychological connectedness. But the issue with this idea of psychological connectedness is that it doesn't really seem to ground the existence of me. Like when I say I, what is it that I'm pointing to? Well, I don't think it's necessarily just my brain or my mind, because there's nothing really grounding my identity in that case. And so what is it then that kind of holds? Because my mental properties are immaterial. So what is it then that holds my mental properties to my physical body? It seems like there has to be something kind of underlying that that kind of grounds and holds your personhood, even when you cease being able to perform your psychological functions. And so it doesn't seem then that psychological connectedness can just do the job of making sure that you're the same person when you wake up as you were when you fell asleep. And so they might be able to respond to the episodic problem in this way, but I think it's still rife with errors. Another kind of glaring error with this idea is that if they're saying that it's not your present ability to perform these functions that grounds your personhood, but it's your psychological connectedness, that means that they're not arguing that you have to be able to presently exercise these functions in order to be a person, but they would claim then that your inherent capacities are what's actually doing the job, because when you're asleep, you're not able to function presently as a person, but you will be able to when you wake up, and that's because you have these capacities inherently. So this is just a disguised form of the inherent capacity view, which is what pro-life people argue. That, yeah, it might be true that a human embryo does not have the present capacity for higher thought or for rationality or for consciousness or all of these other things, but they do have these capacities inherently because these capacities flow from their individual nature, from the fact that they are a human being. So they're actually this idea of psychological connectedness is still an inherent property view, and so if we're going to argue from inherent capacities, then it's not simply our brain that grounds our inherent capacities; it's actually our humanity that grounds them. Because where does our brain come from? Well, it develops out of our body, and so even more fundamental than the brain for our personal properties, even more fundamental is the fact that we have a human nature, because that's where all of our capacities flow from. This psychological connectedness view doesn't do the job of escaping the episodic problem. Um, okay, so now I would like to talk a little bit about a little more about this idea of psychology grounding our personhood. The problem with this is that it's never really argued for why it's our psychology rather than our biology or our nature that grounds our identity as persons, or our personal identity over time. So it's never really argued for. It's really just assumed, and they give a couple of reasons which seem reasonable on the face of it, but when you really dig down deep into it, you realize that it can't really do the job of grounding our personal identity. Now, the first one is arguing simply that our psychological life was what gives a life of a human being meaning. We don't have a meaningful life if we're not able to exercise our psychological functions. And so it seems like the way that my life as a human being has value is because I'm able to engage in higher thought. It's because I'm able to have conscious experiences. I wouldn't enjoy my life if I was just, say, in a persistent vegetative state, or if I was in a coma. But of course, arguing for a meaningful life still, that still would kind of lead to an episodic problem, because someone who's in a reversible coma is not able to lead a meaningful life, and yet we would still say that that we still shouldn't kill them, because there's a good possibility that they will eventually come out of the coma. So this idea of a meaningful life is number one, doesn't really do the job, but number two, it's not really up to us to decide whose life has meaning. There are some, I may not ever want to have some kind of debilitating illness, but someone who has a debilitating illness can still find meaning in their life, and still would take great offense at saying that their life isn't worth living. So you can look at your psychology, and you can say, okay, well, it seems then that I am just kind of that I'm a collection of all of my memories and experiences and all of these kinds of things. And what is it that is responsible for your memories and for your experiences and these kinds of things? Well, it's your brain. Your brain stores all of these things, and so I can think back and say, yeah, I was that kid when I was 10 years old. I went to such and such an elementary school. I had such and such a parents. That was me back then, because I can remember myself back then. And so since I'm a subject of my memory and experiences, then I'm the same person that I was back then. But there are some glaring errors, or some glaring issues with this idea, is that I can't remember everything from my childhood, and yet I would still say that I'm the same person even at the points that I can't remember, be it the things that I can't remember when I was 10 years old, or when I was too young to form memories, such as when I was 1 or 2 years old. I don't remember anything from when I was that young, but I would say that I'm still the same person at that point. If you had killed me then, I wouldn't be around here now to argue the point. So it seems like we can't just be considered a collection of our memories and experiences. There has to be something underlying that grounds our identity, even through the points in which we can't remember. And so, of course, someone who doesn't hold to the psychological view of personal identity or personhood would say, well, it's my biology had to do with that as well. So I'm going to talk about that in depth, probably in a later video. But suffice it to say, I'm not convinced by the psychological view of personhood. And now, the philosopher Eric T. Olson wrote a book defending what he calls animalism, that it's the fact that we're animals is what grounds our identity through time. I think Olson is closer to the truth, but I'm still not in Olson's camp, because I believe that it's our underlying nature that makes us what we are, and that our physical body and our psychology are both important to the human person. And so we're not strictly just our psychology, and we're not strictly just our biology, but everything goes in to make us, and it's our nature that makes us what we are. So it's obvious that we can't just be considered a collection of our thoughts and experiences and memories and those kinds of things. But now a thought experiment that philosophers usually use to ground the idea that we are our brains is what we might call the brain transfer case. That suppose I was in a terrible accident, and my brain was severely damaged, in that I'm never going to be able to regain consciousness, and then someone else whose life is basically over, whose body can no longer sustain his his bodily functions, and he's going to be dying soon. If the doctors were to transplant his brain into my body, if that were a possibility, of course, if they were to transfer his brain into my body, then I would wake up and I would likely have all of his experiences, his memories, all of his consciousness, his conscious awareness of everything he's gone through. So I would have his memories. And so who would I be? Would I be me, or would I be the other guy? And so philosophers will say, well, I would no longer be me because I no longer have my memories, my experiences, my consciousness of my experiences, and those kinds of things. I would actually be the other guy who had his consciousness essentially transferred into my body. And so they would argue that because we have very strong intuition that I would no longer be me, I would be the other guy, then it must be our psychology that's responsible for grounding our identity, not our biology. And so, of course, there's a simple response to this in that, yeah, we might have a strong intuition that says that I'm actually the other person whose brain got transplanted, but the thing is that this is not exclusive to the psychological view. It's actually consistent with Olson's animalism, and it's consistent with my hylomorphism. Since it's consistent with our views, then it can't be used as evidence for the psychological account, because it can be accounted for on these other views. And since there are good reasons to suppose that our views that my view is correct, then it can't count as evidence for the psychological view. And so the question then becomes, well, what is a human person? And I think that there are much better reasons for supposing a human person is something with a human nature rather than just something that has the psychological life of a human being. And that mainly is because everything that we develop into is present right from the very beginning. It's all in my nature, and it's my nature that kind of that develops everything. And so it seems like we can have counterexamples to this case, because a human person then we might say is a rational animal. And the fact is that the reason that we say a human person is a rational animal is because there is a psychological component to us, which is our rationality, and there's also a biological component to us, which is our biological humanity, our physical bodies. So we call ourselves rational animals because we have these two components. And so what is a rational animal then? And well, an animal is an organism, right? So if an animal is an organism, then what is an organism? Well, an organism is an entity that is self-autonomous and develops itself from within, and all of the parts of the organism work together for the good of the whole. So the brain that I will eventually develop, the brain that does become self-aware and conscious, develops out of me from within, develops out of my physical body, because I'm an organism, and all of the parts work together for the good of the whole to keep itself alive and keep itself functioning. So if you were to remove somebody else's brain from their body, that might remove their conscious experiences, their memories, but it would not kill the person themselves. And so if you were to implant this person's brain into me, I would still be the same person, even though I have different memories and different thoughts and experiences, because well, for the same reason that I would remain the same person if you were to, say, transplant a liver into me. If I was suffering liver failure and you transplanted a liver into my body and I were to continue functioning, the liver now becomes part of my body because it's now working together with the rest of my body to function and keep me alive. Well, the same thing happens if you were to transplant somebody else's brain, despite the fact that I now have different memories and experiences. The brain that's transplanted into me continues to keep my body going, and so that brain now becomes part of the overall body, and so it's now able to continue keeping my body alive. So the person over here might be dead because you've removed his brain, and his brain can no longer, and his brain being the kind of the nerve center of his body to keep his body alive, is no longer able to function. And so we can actually see this by, suppose we don't transplant his brain, but suppose now we just remove his cerebral cortex. That I've been in a major accident and my cerebral cortex is damaged, so that I won't be able to become conscious again or form new memories or anything like that. Well, if we transfer this person's cerebral cortex into my brain, and that's all we transfer, well, I might wake up with new memories and conscious experiences and those kinds of things. But the person over here will still be alive. They'll still be a living biological organism. So because his brain is still intact, it's just the cerebral cortex has been removed. So now he's not going to be able to wake up and have new conscious experiences or anything, but he'll continue living as a biological organism just as I will. And so because of the fact that we are biological organisms, it's everything that kind of goes into us that keeps us alive and keeps us functioning. So that's kind of a short explanation as to why this view is consistent both with Olson's animalism and with my hylomorphism as well. And so you can transfer someone's cerebral cortex or someone's brain into my body, but it's because I continue on as a functioning organism that I continue on as the same person. In fact, we can actually see this with a counterexample. That there have been examples of people who've lost probably I think the majority of their brain and have continued to be able to function as a person. And so suppose now, instead of removing the whole brain or just the cerebral cortex, now we divided somebody's brain into half, and we now we put each half of that person's brain into one body and into another, so that both people now have half of the original person's, call him Tim's, brain. So now we have two people who wake up and who have Tim's thoughts and experiences and memories. But Tim now no longer has his brain. And so now the question becomes, well, if the psychological view is correct, which one of these two people, which we could call lefty and righty, as Eric Olson calls them, which of these two people is Tim? Well, it seems that both of these people would believe himself to be Tim, would believe himself to be the original, and they both relate to Tim in the same way. They're both psychologically connected to the original person, Tim. But the problem is that one cannot be identical to two, so it can't be the case that that both people are identical to Tim. They must be brand new people. They can't be Tim. And so this counterexample kind of shows that that it's not psychological connectedness that's responsible for grounding a person's identity. Now, this is obviously a very complicated conversation. I could talk a lot longer on it. In fact, maybe I will at some point talk more about the psychological view. But I think what I've talked about so far kind of shows why a psychological view of personhood is not not just unsuccessful, but is not sufficient to explain what grounds our personal identity. And so in a future video, I will talk about why I believe hylomorphism is the best view of grounding personal identity, of grounding a person's identity and personhood, identity over time. So yeah. Hopefully you found this video informative. Coming up, actually next week, I'm going to be giving a brief presentation to a church in Roundup, Montana. I'm not going to be flying there. I'm actually going to be Skyping it in. So I'm going to temporarily be in two places at once. Take that, physics. So I'm going to give like a 12-minute Pro-Life 101 presentation, and then later on in the day, I'm going to be sitting on a Q&A panel for about an hour. And then between those two events, here locally, I'm going to be playing in Fresno at kind of a community event put on by a church. And so I'm going to be playing with like a piano-driven rock and roll trio, and we're going to play we're going to play basically cover songs. And I've actually been asked to give a little bit of a presentation there too, so it might be something similar to what I talk about in Montana. So we're going to play stuff by like Ben Folds. I'm planning on playing a Steve Taylor tune and some others. So yeah, that's going to be a lot of fun. And then later on in September, September 8th, I believe, whatever that Friday is, I'm going to be at the Bible and Beer Consortium debating atheist YouTube personality Matt Dillahunty on the topic of do we have a right to die? So that's going to be exciting too. If you live locally to Dallas, Texas, make sure to put that on your calendar. And so that's pretty much it for today. So again, I hope you found this informative, and I'll see you next time.